What is up, you guys? Nicolo Maserati here. I know it's been like a super long time, like a really long time since I've uploaded, and I'm sorry for that, guys. It's been insane. As you can see, I'm filming in a different place. Actually, I don't know if you noticed that at all. Filming in a different place. I moved, so I am in a completely different place. I'm actually now living in Canada. So I actually live right down the street from Peter McKinnon, so him and I are hanging out. We're hanging out a lot lately. I'm just kidding. No, I still live in the US. Did I get you guys excited for a second? Like you guys were like, oh my gosh, where is he? Where's he at? No. I just moved to another house in the same city. Today, we're gonna be talking about frame rates. We're gonna be talking about the different kinds of frame rates, when to use certain frame rates. I know like the gold standard is like 24 frames per second, but we're gonna get into like why 24 frames per second is used, when to use 60 frames per second, and when to use 120 frames per second. But first, you guys know, I know it's been a while, but let's just run the intro. Like I said, you guys, today we're going to be talking about when to choose the right frame rate for your project. Let's get into it. So the first one we're going to be talking about is the gold standard for Hollywood. It's what almost every Hollywood movie uses and shoots in. It's 24 frames per second. So first, let's kind of get into the history of 24 frames and why 24 frames became the gold standard. This all kind of started in around the 1920s, 1930s. People were shooting in lower frame rates like 12, 14, or 16 frames per second. But one of the things that they found was that it didn't look super realistic in comparison to what our eyes see. You guys remember silent films, right? So back in that day, before we were blessed with the digital camera age, cameras were hand cranked, and the FPS, the frames per second, could be anywhere from 14 to 26 frames per second, but it was always projected in 24 frames per second. Then in the mid to late 1920s, the Vitaphone came to town that introduced sound to picture. So with frame rates being that low, from 16 all the way up to 26 frames, it was really hard to get the sound and the picture synchronized. So that's when Hollywood decided to start shooting in 24 frames per second. Another reason that 24 frames per second became the film gold standard was because film stocks were incredibly expensive, and 24 frames just kind of helped keep the budget low back in those days. So there's this director of photography, his name's Stephen Poster, and he was the DP for movies like Stuart Little, Donnie Darko, Daddy Daycare, a bunch of different films. And one of the best ways that he put it for why 24 frames has stayed the gold standard this whole time, because with 24 frames, there's fewer frames than our eyes can see, which causes our brains to fill in that missing information and get more actively involved in the film that we're watching. With that being said, filming at 24 frames per second is going to give you the most realistic Hollywood kind of look. Now let's get into 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second. So let me kind of start this off by saying that I thought it was 24 frames per second, and then if you had a camera good enough for 120, it was 120. 60 just kind of falls by the wayside. Since then, I've learned over time why 120 frames per second isn't always the best, why 60 frames per second isn't always the best, and why 24 frames per second isn't always the best. So first, let's just get into when you should use 60 frames per second. So the main time you're going to be wanting to use 60 frames per second is when things are already kind of moving slow. Things like people walking, getting dressed, doing things like that where there's not too rapid of a movement. I'm going to show you a scene from the movie Thor Ragnarok when Tessa Thompson walked in, and that scene in particular was shot at 60 frames per second. As you can see, it's just her walking, but it doesn't need to be super incredibly crazy slow because there's not a whole lot that she's doing other than walking. So if you're filming people walking, getting dressed, anything that's not super fast as it is, shoot in 60 frames per second. Now that you know what to shoot in 24 and you know what to shoot in 60, now let's talk about 120 frames per second. 120 frames per second was like my favorite frame rate to shoot in. In fact, I shot so many videos for clients at 120 frames per second. The entire video was at 120. There's no talking. It was just all those kind of cool Peter McKinnon-esque slow cinematic scenes. Don't get me wrong, it looked really good, but like I said earlier, there's certain times for 24 frames, there's certain times for 60, and there's certain times for 120 frames. The main times you're going to want to be using 120 frames per second, things like people running, sports, animals, different things like that. You know, you have your pets running around, you want to kind of capture that in a cinematic way. 120 frames is a perfect way to do that. It's going to look better than shooting it at 60. But then again, if somebody's just getting dressed or they're just walking slowly towards you, 60 frames is just fine. You can kind of interlink both of those together and you can get some really cinematic shots. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it kind of gave you guys some ideas of when to choose certain frame rates. If you guys would like, we can always talk about higher frame rates, things like 240, 480, and 960. But the reason I really didn't talk about those today is because most people that are watching this channel probably don't have cameras that can do that. But let me know in the comments, guys, if that's something you want to talk about. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button below. It really helps me out. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button and I'll see you guys in the next video.